Good morning and welcome to Oweesta's 7th Annual Native CDFI Capital Access Convening. We are so incredibly happy to have each and every one of you here. I believe we have over 160 registrants, so that is incredibly exciting. We have our Native CDFIs, partners, investors, and constant believers. So again, miigwech for coming. As customary within our national convenings, we are going to start our convening this morning in our opening plenary with a prayer from Marshall DeRock, who is from the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. Quick note, he's very soft-spoken, so within the recording itself, you'll be able to hear much better if you turn on your personal volume on your computer as high as possible. So with that, I will turn it over for an opening blessing for us all attending this convening today.
Bonjour, anyway, Mother Duck. Minos no keys as it is in the cars. Days are tongue and donji. We can aqua jonishana bay and Kada she nishana bay coganda. My yin gun and do them. Greetings, all my relatives. My name is Marshall. I come from the heart of the turtle. Days are tongue. I'm one of the Turtle Mountain people. I come from the Wolf Clan. I say ma and game minigo, John met the mago. Kaknawi or manongum. Anyway, Mother Duck. I was given some tobacco and I was asked to say a prayer for the people here today, all the CAC participants at this gathering. I'll do the best I can. I'll get you mind. Shabom Gakna Yama didn't make Mother Duck. Shabom Gakna Koziok. Shabom Gakna Benojiak, Ta Gogete Nishanabek. Mizie. Mishini Mikanako. Ask the Creator to watch over all the people here today. Watch over the children and the elders all over Turtle Island. Widow Kawashim, Widow Kawashinamji Binabamataziya. Widow Kawashinamji Kwayak Bimoseya. Oma, no gum mama bing. Ask the Creator to help us. Help us live a good life, to walk a good path in life here at this gathering and throughout our whole lives after this. Jawanimishim, Jawanimishinam Gakna Yaoma, Jawanim Gakna Koziwak, Gakna Abenojiak, Jawanim Kete Nishanabik. As the Creator to show us love and to show us pity at this gathering, to pity the sick, the children, the elders, all of the people. Ashambom Gaknawiya, Shambom Hashim, Nimiguchuenda Mejigijigat, Nimiguchuenda Minabamata Zewan, Nimiguchuendam, Anishana Bay Chigenoma. Ask the Creator to guide us. Let them know we're thankful for all these things we have left, the culture and the language and our way of life. Omigwich Kishimai Doga Kanagego. Nimigwich Mandonga Kanagego. Migwich and anyway among the duck. Jibin of Amatazia. I thank the Creator and I thank all my relatives for listening to me here today. Oh, Migwich.
That was beautiful. Again, welcome to Oweesta's 7th Annual Native CDFI Capital Access Convening. Our theme this year of our conference is amplifying our collective voice. As we all know, and some of us don't, or for those who don't, our native CDFI industry has been the catalyst for changes in economic sovereignty, building bridges to small business development, home ownership, and providing avenues to financial freedom and independence through their consumer lending and financial education activities. And through these efforts throughout the years, we've built first-time data sets representing Indian country, and our phenomenal lending efforts, our technical assistance provisions, and individual tribal members served in reaching their financial goals and aspirations. And we've all done this work with extreme sensitivity to our respective populations, integrating our cultural values into our curriculums and provision of services. Our world has changed drastically over the last 3 years. We've become accustomed to living with COVID within our communities. The murder of George Floyd on May 25th spurred a long-awaited response to racism and abuse of marginalized communities of color across the nation. And we're now seeing national funding efforts aimed directly at BIPOC and communities of color within the both governmental and philanthropic space. So when we look at this, the time to amplify our seat at the table has never been greater. As Native American communities, we continue to struggle with having a seat at the table on national policy discussions and being included on larger discussions and creating investment platforms aimed at communities of color. So Oweesta really hopes in providing convening events such as our Native CDFI Capital Access Convening, that both our Native CDFIs and our partners can gain additional experience and perspectives of the needs and successes of our Indigenous communities, support each other with best practices, and ponder how to incorporate Native communities within larger grants and investment opportunities to support our economic growth. And most importantly, we hope that this platform can create new friendships, strengthen existing relationships, and provide a time to learn and celebrate with each other the tenacity, courage, strength, and resilience each and every one of you portray in supporting our Native populations and our economic independence. We have a wonderful agenda over the next 3 days, and we do hope that you join our networking sessions on Wednesday after our opening plenary and use the opportunity to meet new Native organizations and partners and share with each other and forge new relationships and ideas. Again, we want to thank you so very much for attending, and we truly look forward to our next 3 days of learning together. A couple of announcements before we turn our time over to some wonderful speakers and remarks from our congressional representatives. A quick reminder that the OFN and the Oweesta Awards are still open for the Catalyst Award, in which 2 Native CDFIs will receive a $150,000 grant, unrestricted, and 1 Seed Capital Award of $75,000, again unrestricted. We've simplified the application process and really implore you to nominate your organization for these awards, which we will be announcing at the OFN conference held in October this year in New York. And also, a quick reminder that we will be announcing within this conference our first ever Small Business Awards on our opening plenary on day 3 on Thursday, and really hope you can join us in celebrating 2 Native entrepreneurs. Again, we thank you so very much for your time this week, and on behalf of Oweesta, our staff, and our board of directors, thank you for all you do and for showing up each and every day for your communities. And to our partners, Chi Miigwech, to your attendance and your support in advancing our economic dreams of financial freedom for all Native people, encompassing the mainland, Alaska, and Hawaii. And we are now so very happy to present remarks from Senator Murkowski, a great supporter of our Native communities on the congressional stage.
Chimai, good morning and welcome to the 7th Annual Native CDFI Capital Access Convening, hosted by the Oweesta Corporation. I do understand that you had originally planned to hold this event in person in Juneau, but due to COVID concerns, you are now virtual, and I know everyone regrets that. I do hope that one day soon we'll be able to welcome you to the great state of Alaska. In the last 2 decades, we have witnessed transformational change in the economies in Native communities, and this change would not have been possible without the work of Native CDFIs. Well-functioning, accessible capital and credit markets, and programs to increase financial literacy for American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian businesses and entrepreneurs. They really do work to fuel economic development and create jobs. We've certainly seen it firsthand in Alaska. Alaska Growth Capital, a Native CDFI, has successfully secured and deployed over $90 million in new market tax credits. AGC is a major lender in the rural and low-income regions in Alaska that are often underserved by the traditional banking system, including many of our Alaska Native corporations. Since AGC founding in 1997, it has provided over $500 million in capital to its customers, helping them to create and sustain successful businesses that employ tens of thousands of Native people. This also demonstrates the importance of financial tools like the new market tax credits that can help drive investment in American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian communities. In addition to consumer support and long-term capital investment, Native CDFIs have also been there in times of crisis. At the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, Native CDFIs were present to offer temporary assistance to struggling households and small businesses. We saw this in Alaska through the Cook Inlet Lending Center. Even though Cook Inlet Lending Center was incorporated to help community members access financial resources to pursue the goal of home ownership, the pandemic exposed a need for new types of capital investment. So anticipating the challenge ahead, Cook Inlet Lending Center's pivot to help those suffering from the economic impact of COVID-19 resulted in a key partnership with the municipality of Anchorage. And through this partnership, Cook Inlet Lending helped administer financial resources to community members on the municipality's behalf. CILC was recognized for their work during the pandemic by the Opportunity Finance Network, who awarded them the Native CDFI Catalyst Award this past year. It was a super great recognition. But CILC was not alone, and I know that there are many examples of Native CDFIs stepping up to provide help in the communities that you all serve. So I want to thank you all for taking on that responsibility during the pandemic. As Vice Chair of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, I have made sure that economic sovereignty and sustained development in Native communities is a top priority, and I was proud to be one of the chief architects of the bipartisan infrastructure law. I worked hard to make sure that Native communities were front and center as we negotiated and drafted the bill. The tribal investments that we included will help close the digital divide by providing funding for broadband and telecommunication needs. We also secured historic investments for the Indian Health Service, sanitation, water rights settlements, and renewable energy. Native CDFIs, without a doubt, will be called upon to help ensure the successful implementation of this law. So I want to wrap up by thanking you for the great work that all of you do to better the lives of Native people. I hope that your conference is productive, and again, I look forward to welcoming you in person soon, hopefully in Alaska. Thank you and take care.
Well, that was phenomenal. We are so grateful to the Senator for providing comments, and more so than that, for being a constant supporter of our Native communities on a congressional level in DC for our people. And I am so very excited to present our next speaker. We have the honor of having a brilliant, wonderful Native woman be our plenary speaker this morning, Anne Hilton, who is the founder and CEO of the Indigenomics Institute. And we are so happy to have her join us and share so much about our organization and empowerment of Native communities. And with that, Carol Ann, thank you so much for taking your time joining Oweesta today and our participants. It truly is our honor.
Thank you so much for the introduction to come and spend time with you today. I am signing in from the Lekwungen territory in Victoria, British Columbia. Uklasish Caroline Hilton, Heshkweak Supsish Uklas Wakatush Koetsaomti. My traditional name is Wakatush from the Heshkweak Nation, which means big sister, and I come from a line of the oldest woman. My roots are in Nuu-chah-nulth territory on the west coast of Vancouver Island, from the Heshkweak, Ahousaht, and roots as far as the Makah Nation on the tip of Washington. Happy to be here. Thank you so much for the warm introduction to come and spend time and to really uplift the work and the spirit and intention of what you're doing. Although I really was excited at the time the invitation came in to be in Juneau, Alaska. However, to bring this conversation together right now, it brings me a lot of really happiness to see the alignment of the language of economic sovereignty and the expression of that in our modern lives as Indigenous people. I came today to be able to introduce the concept of Indigenomics, which was a word that I was able to shape and to form meaning through the modern tool of social media using the hashtag Indigenomics. Being able to understand that the simplistic number sign is a commonality of bringing together a narrative. What brought me interest was to utilize the hashtag and the word to bring together and form a narrative around the media's response to Indigenous business and economic activity. And in that, essentially, Indigenomics in itself was able to bring attention to the patterns and the trends and the challenges of the Indigenous economy and our experience as Indigenous people. I essentially define Indigenomics as the collective economic response to the lasting legacy of the systemic exclusion of Indigenous peoples in the development of this country. So understanding our experience over time, that essentially the isolation of the Indigenous population was economic in function. Indigenomics is essentially described as the practice of bringing the Indigenous perspective, cultures, traditions, and ways of being to economic and social development. It is a statement of claim of our Indigenous modernity. It is our space that we take up with now of who we are, our intentions, and our collective purpose of indigeneity itself. It's a call out or invitation into an Indigenous worldview in its application in the concepts of development and progress. To understand and essentially bring into focus the Indigenous economy, while we can understand what we are told over time, what economy is, to understand that specifically through an Indigenous perspective and to understand the place where we build from our powerful why. The Indigenous economy exists outside the confines and boundaries of all that we know today about modern economics and its measures of growth. Instead, the Indigenous economy exists within our relationship to ourselves, to each other, to the earth, to our past, and to our future. That is the Indigenous economy. To understand our experience of the structure of radical exclusion of Indigenous peoples. Here in Canada, we have Duncan Campbell Scott, who formed essentially the early policy that shaped the Indigenous relationship. Here he describes essentially, our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. There is no Indian question, no Indian department, and that is the whole objective. Through the concept of Indigenomics, I essentially assert that we have inherited through the lens of the Indian problem, that the Indian was something to be solved for, to be addressed, or to be isolated. The concept of Indigenomics today is about designing for addressing the current Indigenous poverty levels. It's about addressing the long-term economic devaluing of Indigenous knowledge systems. So in that, how do we revalue Indigenous economic knowledge today? To increase Indigenous social and economic well-being, to increase the space for Indigenous worldview in economy, and address the conditions of economic regression. I essentially introduced that Indigenous peoples have gone through 4 stages. Prior to disruption as the first stage, our economies were in whole and intact. With disruption, essentially the systemic disruption of existing Indigenous economic systems, ways of being, and removal from the land, looking at the severing our inherent authority and responsibility to place, the dehumanizing of indigeneity through instruments such as the Doctrine of Discovery or the Indian Act or other legal and statutory approaches around the world. The second phase is entanglement, characterized by the complexity of the entanglement of the Indigenous relationship. This is firmly embedded within conflict stemming from the disruption of Indigenous ways of being and knowing, and addressing the continued threats to our ways of life. The next stage is emergence, the third stage characterized by the emergence of Indigenous legal environment. This legal context essentially serves to reinforce new modern economic space for Indigenous nations, businesses, and governments. To be able to understand and essentially look at the final stage of empowerment, where we're currently at, of looking at the rise of Indigenous economic empowerment as an effect of the shifting Indigenous rights and title, legal environment, economic equality, and inclusion. This stage essentially sees the significant increase of Indigenous business development, and to be able to bring into focus this new modern Indigenous economic space that we are filling today. The power center of the Indigenous economy, the recognition and upholding of indigeneity itself, the unfolding and evolving Indigenous relationship as expressed through rights and title, increased representation, and finally, the ability to manage risk and to be able to manage resources within our territories. To bring into focus, again, this concept and structure of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, a legal function with an economic outcome. This in itself essentially describes that Indigenous peoples have the right to an economy. I essentially assert the concept that Indigenous peoples are the only ones who have had to fight for the right to an economy and its structure in all of its processes. It is in the expression of rights and title that we essentially form the narrative of our future. The Indigenomics Institute essentially places the role of the power question, stating questions are the architecture of our future. The questions that we ask today shape and form the future and our economic identity and sovereignty. In 2019, the Indigenomics Institute facilitated the inception of the concept of a $100 billion national annual Indigenous economy. That in itself, while a preliminary number that are likened specifically in Canada, 5% of the Indigenous population could potentially generate 5% of the total GDP, essentially coming to a $100 billion Indigenous annual economy. To upset the narrative from the underperformance of the Indigenous economy, the lack of the status quo and the underperformance essentially established a forward-looking trajectory to begin to establish the framework for measuring Indigenous economic strength. The Institute essentially facilitates the activating the financial architecture of the national Indigenous economy to be able to align and move outside of the boxes that the growth of the Indigenous economy cannot exist solely within government programs and services, but needs to be activated within the actual financial architecture of the markets and the larger economy itself. The Institute facilitates the language of Indigenous economic design, introducing 12 levers of Indigenous growth and design. Leadership in equity ownership, looking at infrastructure as economic stimulus for our communities and nations. The role of procurement as an economic tool for growth and design and inclusion. Fourthly, the role of trade in the Indigenous economy. The growth of Indigenous entrepreneurship, capitalization of the Indigenous economy, the role of clean energy, social enterprise, and finally, reconciliation and the philanthropic community, leadership in the structures of commerce, technology, and the investment environment, all of these establishing increasing levels of Indigenous economic activity. To design our place and to design our increased economic activity in these areas, to be able to bring into focus the Indigenomics Institute essentially facilitates a larger visual presence of Indigenous economic strength. At the international level, the concept of our collective Indigenous economic response to understand that economy has largely been built from a singular perspective, that we need to expand that out to include other worldviews to meet a just transition to a 2050 target. It is in the expansion of worldview where we find solutions. The Global Center is essentially facilitating the establishment of an Indigenous virtual market using those 12 levers to network in global Indigenous economic strength. The establishment of an annual Indigenous Economic Conference, and finally, to establish a World Indigenous Economic Forum, to be able to bring and build this platform and space for Indigenous economic worldview. To understand and build from the place of economic reconciliation, that in itself must serve as this being able to build from the space between the lived realities of Indigenous peoples, the need to build understanding of the importance of the Indigenous relationship, and the requirement for progressive action for economic inclusion. The concept of Indigenomics has always been an invitation. It's an invitation to build the financial architecture of modern Indigenous economic strength. It's an invitation to meet the head-on the challenges of what has been described in terms of the access to capital and the increasing pathways of entrepreneurship and corporate partnership. The concept of who wants to play Indigenomics in itself is essentially reflected in the book Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table, which first sets out to define what is the Indigenous economy, what is Indigenous growing economic space, what is the distinctions of an Indigenous worldview. Again, thank you so much for the opportunity to come and spend time with you today. Amplifying our collective economic voice is our task and our response to our experience over the last number of hundred of years. The expression of economic sovereignty and our ability to measure Indigenous economic strength, that is Indigenomics. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carol Ann. That was a wonderful presentation and share. Thank you for sharing. We are closing a little early today, but we want to definitely invite you to join us at 12 p.m. Mountain Time. Click on the next link, and that will be a Community Reinvestment Act discussion. And we will, which will be facilitated by Chrystel Cornelius. And I also wanted to make mention to the amazing CAC gift boxes that were sent out if you registered. And what was included in that box was an Alaskan woven blanket, 8th generation socks, spray smudged, and Bidre chocolates. So we welcome you to get cozy with the items that are in the gift box and join us for the next 3 days of informative sessions and panels. So we'll log out of this session and then we'll jump back in at 12 p.m. Mountain Time. So welcome everyone.